How do you conclude which stance of gait each pelvis is stuck in after you assess your clients? AKA, how do you treat these things? The first thing I want to say is we're never stuck in any one position. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is I get this a lot is people think of asymmetries, I feel like I'm rotated more to the right and I can't rotate to the left, or my left innominate's a bit more prominent than the others. So I just want to be very clear that it's not uncommon and it's very normal to have asymmetries side to side. If you feel that you have a femur that's internally rotated and your tibia is externally rotated, some of that to some degree is probably normal, and it doesn't mean you're stuck in a particular phase of gait and you're only early stancing it and you never hit late stance. You're still walking, right? So just public service announcement in that regard. There's a friend of mine, name's Veronica. She's really smart. I'll link her in the show notes. She had this cool saying where if you took a microscope and you looked at it underneath your food, you would see a ton of microbes you probably would never eat. So we don't do that, but we still eat, right? Same thing with movement. We get into the nitty gritty, but it doesn't mean that you're broken because you exhibit these particular things. Anyways, how do we conclude instead of what you're stuck in, what areas you need to work on? Public service announcement before you get into looking at what phase of gait I need to focus on. Ask yourself this: am I really stacking? And if the answer is no, which it more often than not is, forget about this. Pause the video, come back to it, go to the stack video that I'll link in the show notes for you, and get really freaking good at that. Because if you don't have that, the stuff I'm going to be talking about with this pelvis is a moot point. So please stack first. And this is going to be extra important when we're talking about what assessment findings would implicate me working on either early stance, mid stance, or late stance. Because when I would work on one of these particular gait phases, the time that I go after that is if there is a clear and distinct asymmetry present in movement after I've stacked my supreme clientele like a boss. Many times when you're doing your assessment, you're going to say, well, this person has 100 degrees of hip flexion on the left and they got 107 on the right. Clearly that's an asymmetry and we need to work on an asymmetrical thing. False. Well, it is an asymmetry. That person is still restricted bilaterally. Many times when you have a bilateral restriction, you need to work on simpler components first and make that a clear and distinct asymmetry. Many times if you stack someone and you go through some of the progressions that I've gotten on my website, that person may go from a 145 degree hip flexion on the left and they could be like a 125 on the right. You didn't have to get too fancy. Master the basics first. It is in that latter scenario that I talked about, someone has full hip flexion on one side, limited on the other, that the phases of gait become much more important. I want you to think about this. Remember the heuristic that we discussed when we were talking about how gait works. If I'm doing one motion on one side, I'm going to be doing the exact opposite motion on the other side. So in early stance, and we'll use the left as our reference point. And the reason why we're going to use left as our reference point is because more often than not, we're going to be working on left stance when we're talking about restoring phases of gait. And the reason why that is because as human beings, we do have a right-sided bias. This is pretty clear in some of the research that was done in the Spine Journal from 06 to 07. There's an ad nauseum amount of people who talk about asymmetries within the body, ranging from PRI to the Dunnington stress pattern to the common compensatory pattern by Zink, ad nauseum. So it's there, it's a thing. We want to respect that. The right-sided bias is there. We're going to be going more to the left than Beyonce did on one of her earlier albums. Now, let's say someone needs to work on early stance phase of gait. Remember, folks, the sacrum needs to begin rotating left, but the femurs, and this is the key that lets you know what phase you got to work on. If the left femur is in a flexed, abducted, and externally rotated position, guess what they're going to be limited in? They're going to be limited in extension, adduction, and internal rotation. If you have restrictions in those motions, chances are you might not need to work on early stance mechanics. What that means is you would choose activities where the left leg is in front, the right leg is in back, and you begin rotating the pelvis to the left. A great move that I have for this would be a bottoms up shifty split squat where the left leg's in front and you're pointing the zipper to the left. You come up, proceed to hate life. It is brutal. So brutal, but so glorious in many ways. Try that, because if you got someone with those particular limitations, or on the right side, they'll have a limitation in flexion, abduction, ER based measures. You see that presentation and they've stacked, that's a good time to start working on that early stance shift. Once you get that down pat, and if they still have that particular restriction present, limitation in extension, adduction, IR on the left, limited flexion, abduction, ER on the right, you can actually skip mid-stance and go to late, because the motions that should be happening at the sacrum will be the same, and same thing with the femur. If I can get into late stance, then that means that I have been able to place my body, my femurs in particular, into extension, adduction, IR, and flexion, abduction, ER. So that's actually your terminal progression, and you won't have to do much of the frontal plane shifting. A move that I like would be a classic posterior hip stretch, where the left leg is back, the right leg is in front. You're rotating the sacrum to the left, getting a big stretch in the back of the hip. So if you see someone with a loss of left extension, adduction, IR, and a loss of right flexion, abduction, ER, you're going to start working early stance. Once you see some progression in motion, you're then going to work late stance with those people. The one thing that we're missing is mid-stance based activities, aka working on this frontal plane shifting action. So think lateral squats, lateral lunges, or one of my favorite moves, the table side stride. Anything where you're creating an oblique angle of the pelvis, where the left innominate would be higher than the right, because we're using the left leg as our reference point. In this particular situation, I am going to be in more hip extension when I'm in mid-stance. And I might be able to have some adduction and IR, but I typically won't have enough. This is when I'm thinking I need to work on this. If I see someone on the left-hand side, the left leg, if they have a limitation in hip flexion and they can't fully internally rotate, frontal plane shifting seems to be money. And I think the reason why that is because if I need mid-stance, well, and I have early stance, well, I'm probably getting some degree of hip extension in this situation. But what I might not be able to do is I might not be able to drop the hip down into adduction and internal rotation. But consider this, if I'm approaching mid-stance and I do have some femoral extension on the left, I actually might have a limitation in hip flexion on that side, because I'm moving towards extension of the hip. If you see left flexion and internal rotation limited, you probably need to do some type of frontal plane shifting. Moves I like. Table side stride is an awesome move. That's where you have your left foot on a book and you're creating this oblique angle of the pelvis, pushing yourself into the left leg. Anything that drives pure frontal plane adduction combined with internal rotation is absolute money to restore this phase of gait. And a lot of times I'll even see a loss of IR on the swing leg be restored by working in this position as well. And I think this goes back to what Bill Hartman has so eloquently put together, is when I'm in that mid stance, there's going to be internal rotation happening throughout the pelvis. So even if you're doing something like with that table side stride, where I'm doing more of an abduction, external rotation based activity, the pelvis in total is still relatively IR'd, and it seems to be useful in that regard. So if you see someone with a loss of hip flexion on the stance leg, which would be left, you probably want to work on some frontal plane shifting based activities. To summarize your amazing question and core, if you have a loss of hip extension on the left and a loss of hip flexion on the right, you're probably going to be spending time working early and late stance. Start with early. If you see some progression in motion but it's not full, then you want to progress to late. If you see someone where they have a loss of IR on the stance leg, and maybe they have a loss of hip flexion as well, that's when I think frontal plane shifting is very useful. And those are really your big tactics, is you have a rotational shift for early and late, you have a frontal plane shift for mid stance, and if you mess with those moves, you're probably going to be moving and grooving and mastering the gait cycle like a legend.